טוב לכולם. פרופסור בלזר ביקש ממני, ואני שמח להציג את המרצה שלנו הבוקר ולקדם אותו בברכה. אני אעבור לאנגלית. It's a great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for Grand Rounds this morning, Dr. Marc Wilkenfeld. He's a graduate of McGill University with a BSc in physiology and completed his medical degree at the University of Vermont College of Medicine and then postgraduate residency in occupational environmental medicine at Mount Sinai in New York. And as you can see, he's currently the head of occupational and environmental medicine at Winthrop and an assistant professor at that institution with appointments, I believe, also at Columbia and other New York universities. He's written many articles and book chapters and has lectured throughout the world, including here last year at the 2015 summit. Some of you may have attended his really very excellent lecture. The mayor of Haifa was there. After the attacks at the World Trade Center, he served as an expert review panel member for the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency in the U.S., on a technical advisory task force, and consulted for government agencies, corporations, community groups on the environmental health impact of that horrible disaster. He reviewed pre- and post-cleaning data and had to provide high-level responses regarding the health effects of contamination with World Trade Center dust, and became probably one of the world's experts in that area. He moderated and participated in many community forums. He was a medical consultant for the deconstruction of the forum, what was the Deutsche Bank building on Liberty Street, which was also badly damaged. And he's actually treated personally hundreds of 9/11 survivors and responders throughout the area related to that tragedy. He's been honored for that work with a Gold Award for providing compassionate medical care from the relevant foundations, and he's been listed as the best doctor in the region that he serves for several years in a row by various magazines and rating agencies. He's past president of the New York Occupational Medicine Association, medical advisor to many leading decision makers and politicians in New York State, and as I mentioned, has lectured extensively. His research focuses on medical and psychological consequences of such disasters, and he shared our knowledge with us last year and will also share a unique perspective with this year as well, relevant to Haifa. We see the title of his lecture there, but before I ask Marc to come up, I will also mention probably the most important aspect of what gets us excited, and that is that he's moving to Israel with his wife, Shana, and their twin young sons, and joining us here at Rambam, God willing, in September, joining the department, formerly headed by Afi Wiener, who's sitting there, currently by Mark Allen Levy, current director of occupational and environmental medicine at Rambam, a tremendously important department in the country, I think, one of the leading departments in the country, and I think Mark's addition to the staff will be a tremendous addition. So we look forward to hearing you, Marc. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Skorecki. And you know, it's a unique situation. Most of the time when you travel thousands of miles to speak to a group, you don't feel like you're coming home. You know, when you go to speak in Europe or in Asia about something, you really feel like you're a foreign country. So I want to say thank you, first of all, Dr. Skorecki, to Shraga. You told me to call you Shraga, right? And to the entire staff here, because they truly make you feel like you've come back home. And we left the 2-year-old twins. Dr. Skorecki didn't tell you that the twins are 2 years old. And so we also feel very rested because they've been at home. So I'm going to speak to you this morning. There's not a lot of occupational medicine training in the United States or in Israel. So I always enjoy speaking to the various specialties about what it is that we do, because it's very, very, very different. And what I'm going to talk to you about this morning is I know, the reason I came here to speak at the summit last year, because there's a lot of concern, as all of you know, about pollution in the Haifa area particularly, and the effects on health, and what the government is doing right now in order to reduce it, which ultimately reduces the two things. reduces the burden of disease, and it also reduces the bad publicity that Haifa gets in the media, which I think is just as important. It was interesting because, Dr. Skorecki said, you're coming to set yourself up in Israel, why don't you give grand rounds? And I said, sure, I'll give grand rounds. But then I thought, what am I going to talk about? So usually I talk about World Trade Center issues because everyone's so fascinated by it. And we have a cohort of 60,000 patients in the States who've been affected by 9/11. But I can't give the same lecture twice because, some of you were probably here last year. So, it's very interesting. Haifa is not the first city in the world to have pollution problems. And what have other cities done about it? Probably the best example is Beijing, because when Beijing got the Olympics, part of the deal in getting the Olympics was to reduce the amount of pollution for two reasons. Mainly because they were worried about the athletes' health. It's almost like a worker issue. So I want to talk a little bit about what they did and actually how it affected, because this is the first time that we've had physiologic studies that shows what reducing pollution actually does to the human body and what it can do to people. We focused a lot on cancer, and I've read a lot of the media reports in some of the medical journals, like the Jewish Press and the Times of Israel, that show the different rates of cancer changing. A little bit more worried about the heart disease and the lung disease than we are about the cancer. So I want to show you what we learned from Beijing. Okay, so, what is environmental medicine, first of all? I used to call myself an occupational physician, and, Dr. Levy, you'll realize this soon, I think. There's too many of those around. So now we call ourselves environmental physicians. So our goal is to decrease the rates of disease by reducing exposure to substances that cause disease. And we do that by actually interacting with government, interacting with policy decision makers, interacting with industry, and also through medical monitoring of exposed populations. But ultimately, we're doctors, so we treat people as well. Now, the doctor that discovered that asbestos causes cancer and other diseases, he told me a long time ago when I was a fellow, he said that science should guide policy. Policy does not guide science. Now, what does that mean? That means, last year we had the mayor of Haifa with us, and policymakers have to base their decisions about health issues on what experts tell them. Okay, so our goal in occupational environmental medicine is to show what the risk of exposure is and the benefits of lowering the exposure, and that way we can influence government at international, national, local levels. One of the best examples is my chairman Phil Landrigan at Mount Sinai, who was able to show that lead had an effect on the development of children, and because of that, gasoline in the United States took the lead out. One occupational doctor actually resulted in lead being removed from gasoline, which probably saved thousands and thousands of children. Okay, so we talked about this a little bit. Air pollution is a major concern in Haifa. Media reports, which actually is a lot more important than you think. Population, people in general, if you read something in the Jerusalem Post or the New York Times, that's a lot more influential than seeing stuff in medical journals for most of the population. It's a health issue, and it's also a public relations issue. And I hear it myself. People say, you're moving about Haifa? Aren't you worried about bringing your kids to Haifa? So it's something that we need to deal with. You're lucky here, and I said this last year. I wish the mayor was in the audience today so I could compliment him and get on his good side some more. The municipal government is responsible to protect the health of its citizens. Government relies on doctors like myself in order to tell them what to do. But the biggest problem, and the mayor said this last year, he says, I have one expert telling me one thing, I have another expert telling me another thing, what should I do? So what's the answer to that? What should you do? And I think what you should do is look at the studies like the one I'm going to show you today, and that way you have objective evidence. Because as you can imagine, a lot of this is not scientific. A lot of this is very political. And when you talk about pollution, when you talk about cancer, when you talk about diseases of children, when you talk about heart disease, it becomes emotional, but we always have to go back to the science. And I think what I'm going to show you today is very, very good science. Okay, so I'll give you a brief outline because you need to know a little bit about pollution. And I'm going to talk about Dr. Kippen out of Rutgers, the experiments that were headed by him in Beijing. All right, now, you might think Haifa is the worst place for pollution, but it's far from the worst place. 3 out of the top 10 problem cities in the world are in Nigeria because of the congestion. Because what causes pollution? 2 things mainly, industry and cars. And in Nigeria, they have problems with both. China's had huge problems, as you know. Russia and the United States, the most difficult city in the United States to live in terms of pollution is not New York, and it's not Los Angeles, it's probably Salt Lake City. So we've had some very interesting things. Dr. Skorecki mentioned that in 2017, when I give my grand rounds, I hope, if I'm invited back, when I give my grand rounds, we'll talk about water next time. And it's another example. It's media issues, and you've all heard about Flint, Michigan, but that's a whole another hour of grand rounds. We'll do that next year. So what is air pollution? Air pollution is anything that's solid or liquid suspended in air. It includes smoke, fumes, soot, or any other product of combustion. Now you also have, 9/11, and I'll show you some pictures of the aftermath of 9/11. Everyone focused on asbestos and lead on mercury originally, but what's really dangerous in terms of lung disease is natural particles as well, dust. Okay. You have primary particles and you have secondary particles. You can have pollutants that hang on to the particles. And the way we look at it by diameter. So what are the measures of pollution? You have the PM 2.5 and the PM 10. And those are the two measures that the EPA uses as a target. So what's a target? You want to have the numbers at a certain level which are considered safe for human health. Now, after 9/11, I learned some very, very interesting things because that was lower Manhattan and there was a lot of pollution because the towers collapsed and there was a lot of dust. And we had the targets, but the problem is in New York City in August, you never reach those targets anyway. So the targets are meant to be protective of health. Now, when you look at the public health behind this, is very, very interesting. So there's a way, this is the global burden of disease, and this will show you by condition what the effect is on disability life years. And you can see that there's the kinds of things that in general medicine we worry about. We worry about high blood pressure, we worry about smoking, alcohol, diet, okay? And you can see that there's different breakdowns here about what the effect is. So for high blood pressure, the effect on heart disease, okay? If you look down the list, you'll see that high body mass index will also have a huge effect on heart disease. High plasma glucose, same thing, okay? Pollution, cancers, all right? Diet high in sodium, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so let's go back to this for a second. When you look at disability-related life years, and I know, I do some general practice as well, as many of you might, and, we're always checking blood pressure, and we have all these goals that we have to meet, and you get a note from quality assurance if you didn't meet the goals, and cholesterol, the same thing. So number 9 on that list that I just showed you is ambient air pollution. So if you could fix one thing about a patient, and you had your choice between elevated cholesterol, elevated LDL, and exposure to ambient air pollution levels, and you chose the ambient air pollution levels, you would have a bigger impact on their life in terms of morbidity, mortality, and disability than you would by fixing their cholesterol, which is not something we think about. Something we think even less about, and the reason we think less about it is because it's not really a problem in the developed world, is there's household inside the house in many parts of Africa and Asia because of the way they use their ovens and their stoves. They get problems with indoor air pollution, and that has more impact on health than diabetes, basically. So, as physicians, it's not something that we think about. All right, and these are just some early examples of air pollution. This was a factory in Denora, Pennsylvania, and you can't see it, but there's a handwritten letter from a resident of Denora, Pennsylvania, and they're writing to the government, and they're saying, we think that the pollution is bad, and I'll paraphrase, and that's because the paint on the houses seems to be corroding off every time the factory has a release of pollution. Okay, and if you look at disease, you can actually correlate in London. You can correlate the death rate with the levels of sulfur dioxide on a daily basis. And if there's any epidemiologists in the room, I know that you can look at this and take it apart and say it may not make any sense. But as a global influence, we can see that pollution is linked to bad health. And I'll show you these were actually the first scientific studies. The one I'm going to talk about that were done in Beijing are probably the best objective evidence of this. So I'm not that familiar with the Israeli system yet, but I know that until 1970 there wasn't much regulation of clean air. Clean Air Act went through the Senate and through Congress in 1970, and it mandated the identification of pollutants which may reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health and welfare. And it asked that we establish criteria, and based on the latest scientific knowledge, and these things are always changing. So what's a safe level? Which is the real question. And this also gave us the first ambient air quality standards for total suspended particulates. Okay, and these are the different criteria that are used. These are the different measures that are actually regulated right now. levels of particulate matter, PM10 and PM2.5 are probably the most important. And you can actually go on the internet and see for your city what the levels are on a given day. All right, so we know from, and I'm just going to take, for those of you that weren't in the audience last year, we know that from World Trade Center exposure that the acute exposure to very high levels of PM10 and PM2.5 resulted in a huge burden of disease. We now have 60,000 people in our cohort from levels to very high caustic levels of PM10 and PM2.5, and the results of these exposures included asthma, GERD, and sinusitis. Okay, but this is what we're talking about. This is not a chronic exposure to a relatively moderate level. This is an acute exposure to exceptionally high levels. Okay. All right, and again, this is a graph that shows you the increase in cardiovascular and respiratory disease, change in mortality with each 10 microgram per meter cubed of PM10, which again is the big particulate. So you can see that as you raise the levels in different cities during the year, you get a fairly substantial. And I'll talk about what this means substantial, because you may say, oh, 2%, what's the big deal, right? But I'll show you why it's important. And this shows you just how many cities there are throughout the United States with these issues. This is a very interesting slide. I actually took this slide from Dr. Kippen, as I did some of my others, with his permission, because I know I'm being taped. So this shows the risk of experiencing acute myocardial infarction after time spent driving, because we know that on the highways you have the highest level of pollutant exposure. This is adjusted for the time of day, strenuous exertion, being outdoors, and standing up. All right, so this shows that there's a very marked, significant increase in relative risk of having an MI after driving. Now you're going to say, and I've driven in Israel, I've actually let my wife do the driving, but you can say that it may not only be physical, it may not only be the pollution, it might be stress related. But this is a worldwide phenomenon, okay? This is what we talk about in terms of cancer, and there's been a lot of controversy, and I've talked to some of the cancer specialists here about whether the cancer increases that you find in Haifa are real or not, and this will just show you that the relative risk. So when we talk about smoking, right, the relative risk of a current smoker for lung cancer increases 9.73 with a range of 5.96 to 15.9. We know that with asbestos, it's actually less than that. It's actually 5 times increase. The two together is a synergistic increase of 90 times. So that's an exceptionally high increase in cancer rates due to exposure. Increase in fine particulates and sulfates will give you increases in relative risk of 1.36 and 1.03, which again are not what we would call significant. But if you look at the range from sulfates, you'll see that it is significant. It's between 1.11 and 1.66. And the real issue is this, and this is what doesn't really get across to people that much. You're talking about hundreds of millions of exposed populations. When we do studies on factory workers in occupational medicine, we're looking at 100 workers, 1,000 workers. Even our cohort of World Trade Center exposed individuals is 60,000. Talking about hundreds of millions of exposed individuals with air pollution. So even a small but significant increase in relative risk results in a large number of deaths. Okay, and this is just a slide that shows you a little bit of the physiology behind it. The exposure to these substances results in changes in the inflammatory process, in oxidative stress. You get an autonomic nervous system imbalance, which leads to various vulnerabilities in the cardiopulmonary system and vasoconstriction. But the ultimate result, I think, is the orange part. You can result in acute MI, stroke, congestive heart failure, and a buildup of plaque in the arteries. Okay. All right, and this again is attributable fraction for triggers of MI. So if you look at MIs throughout the United States, the prevalence of exposure, and that's what I was talking about with the incidence of disease related to the amount of exposure. If you look at cocaine use as a risk factor, only 0.04% of the population in the United States are regular cocaine users. That's country, right? That's not New York City. So if you get a change in the relative risk up to 23.7, okay, then your PAF becomes 0.9%. All right, that's with a relative risk of 23.7. Air pollution with a relative risk of 1.02 right, which is relatively minor, you result in a PAF of 1.5%, 1.57%. So you can see the real impact on health that this has. Okay, so we'll talk about China. I know that some of you are very, very interested in China. And this is a sunny day in Beijing. Probably many of you have been there, and you've seen the pollution firsthand. And so what happened was, as part of the political process in China's drive to join, you always read about the Boxer Revolution in the 1800s. China's always had this drive to become part of Western society. And the ultimate, one of the ultimate things that you can do if you want to become part of Western society is you host the Olympics. So they went through the whole process, which you probably know is very competitive, and they made it down to the finalists. And they made a deal, actually. They said, if you can reduce your pollution from what it is now, right, which is 130 micrograms per meter cubed to PM10, and 100 micrograms per meter cubed to PM2.5, and you can get it down to 50 and 30, then you can have the Olympics. If you don't meet that goal, there's no Olympics, and a lot of Chinese high government officials will be sent to different labor camps throughout the country, and it won't be a very, very pretty thing. So they decided to do everything possible in order to achieve this. My wife told me that it's in Israel, and you shouldn't be too funny here. It's not like American audiences where you can tell jokes, but I couldn't help. I told Dr. Skorecki and Traga last night that the way they achieved this was very interesting. They actually brought in 10 million Chinese from the countryside, and told everyone to take a deep breath, and everyone did it. Then they sent them back to the countryside, and they let them exhale, and they reached their target. But that's not really how they did it. But they did it in 3 ways. So what produces pollution? And again, I'm talking on a very basic level. What produces pollution is industry and cars, okay? So they restricted the different industries throughout the area, starting 2 weeks before. They set it up so that 1 million cars that usually come into Beijing can't come in, all right? And the second level was they stopped another 1 million cars from coming in. They did dust suppression. They closed down more factories. They actually closed factories, all right? And then they went to a system where they had an odd and even system where, depending on your license plate number, it either allowed you or didn't allow you to come into the city. And even the electricity, one of the major polluters is manufacture of electricity, and they actually switched the system so that the electricity was made further away from Beijing. It's truly amazing. So the point is that it is possible to do. It is possible to reduce this pollution, and I'll show you at the end, because I started this off by saying, well, what can Haifa learn? What can Haifa learn from Beijing? And as I researched this, I found out that Haifa's already started on the proper road to fixing this, and there's probably a lot that Beijing can learn from Haifa. And we'll talk about this at the very end, and we'll shoot for the Olympics here in 2022. We don't have many mosquitoes, so we should be okay for the Olympics. But from a scientific point of view, and again, I have to thank Dr. Kippen because he really set this up, and he traveled to China, and I had him give grand rounds about 3 weeks ago at Winthrop, and I took him out to dinner. I took him to Abigail's in New York, and the one thing he told me is, you can take me anywhere you want, but I don't want to eat Chinese food, which shows how much time the guy spent in China during the Olympics. And he's professor and chair. A very modest guy, but I said I have to give him credit. Professor and chair of occupational medicine at Rutgers. All right, so what's the hypothesis? The hypothesis is here you have the perfect experiment. You have before a lot of pollution, less pollution, and then what did they do after the Olympics? They didn't say this is great for our people. They said, okay, we can turn everything back on. The pollution went back up to exactly where it was. So using biomarkers of systemic inflammation, endothelial dysfunction, coagulation, and autonomic dysfunction, as well as oxidative stress, the hypothesis was, and it's almost, sometimes you go to cocktail parties and you tell non-medical people what you're working on, and you tell them, well, if you lower the pollution, things will get better in the human body, and if you raise the pollution, it'll get bad again. And they say, well, for this you became a professor? Because it's almost intuitive. But what happened was there is no objective evidence of this. And so what you have is industry and other people saying, well, it's not really true. It's not so bad. So this was the first study to actually show the impact. And it was done with Peking University. This is Peking in China. It's not the Peking that you have in, up north here. Peking University First Hospital. And this is the air monitoring site. Okay, and there were different measures of pollution on campus, and those included the ones that I told you about: PM10, PM2.5, black carbon, PAHs, metals, et cetera, ozone, sulfuric acid, nitrogen oxide, and carbon monoxide. And what did they get for subjects? And I think this is worldwide. The people that they had as the human subjects were actually the medical students. And you can see that they had 125 students. The age is what you would expect in China, 24, height, weight, et cetera. But you know, it's a selection bias, because when you think about patients, and we always get these alerts in New York City, you get an alert on your iPhone showing, you know, do not tell your elderly and frail and asthmatic patients not to go outside today. These are medical students who, as you know, can be exposed to almost anything and survive. So this is actually a very, very healthy population. So if anything, you're going to get a healthy worker effect on these. This is the schedule. The Olympics started on July the 20th, 2008. They ended September 24th, 2008. So the plan was to do the measurements, the biologic monitoring before, during, and after. Okay, so from an air quality point of view, this is what it looked like. This is what it looked like before, okay? And this is what it looked like after. So it is possible. You know, people say there's nothing you can do, but there is something you can do. So that's what the air looked like. The various physiological endpoints and biomarkers that were measured, and I can get you these slides. I can show you more of this if you're interested individually. There are measures of inflammation, which included exhaled breath condensate, pH, isoprotein, nitrates. There's measures of autonomic tone, which are blood pressure and heart rate. There's precoagulation, which is von Willebrand's factor, measures of platelet aggregation, and systemic inflammation. Okay, so most of you are familiar with all of these markers. And so this is the concentration change in pollutants from before to during the Olympics. And you can see that there's some very significant changes. This is what you would expect. They've actually reduced some of these markers 50%. With a range of up to 100% when it came to sulfuric acid. Okay? So from an experiment, it's almost like a bench experiment. So now you have your situation where you have before and after. Okay? And again, you know, this is what bothers me the most, is they just let it go back. Okay? Which is from a public health point of view, they really had an opportunity to protect the Chinese population, and they didn't, because as soon as the Olympics were over, and the International Olympic Committee went home, everything just went back to where it was before, exactly. So that's one of the lessons, I think. And that's not what Haifa is doing. Haifa is working on a long-term solution. This is unique because it's a short-term solution. Okay, and these are the biomarker changes from before to after. All right, so if you look at the measures of inflammatory disease in the lungs, you can see, again, it almost correlates. Right? It's down 60%, down 20%. Significant decreases in von Willebrand's factor and various other markers. So what are the significant changes? Significantly, and we can go back to this slide, you can see that, you know, from a statistical point of view, the changes were decrease in exhaled breath markers of pulmonary inflammation, significant decrease in markers of platelet aggregation, and a decreased heart rate and blood pressure. And this is what happened after. And again, you know, it's very sad in a way. Everything goes right back up to normal. Not to normal, but to where it was. Okay, and again, you know, significant, all the markers increased significantly. All right, so what are the conclusions of this? So from this study, which again is probably the first and only study of its kind, air pollution clearly leads to respiratory inflammation and oxidative stress, systemic inflammation and platelet activation in healthy young adults. Now, if you think about it, again, you know, medical students are about as healthy as can be. If you transfer this over to your asthmatic and your patients with emphysema and heart disease, it's going to be even worse. Right? So this first thing it did was it validated the utility of the biomarkers, and it also showed that the biomarkers are reversible. It's the first real-world study, and it expanded on previous lab studies and measured a large suite of particular matter components and measured a larger suite of biomarkers. It provides a mechanistic explanation of the epidemiologic findings. And we also understand the time frame. See, that's the thing. When you talk about smoking, we always tell our patients, and I don't know what you tell them here. I guess I'll find out. But we tell our patients that within 7 years of stopping to smoke, your risk of lung cancer goes back to baseline. In this case, we could see that within hours, or days of reduction of exposure to air pollution, your risk of disease goes back pretty much to baseline. All right, and we also know that the exposure is reversible. I was in the New York Times a lot after 9/11, actually, and one of the articles they did was I had a patient, and he had severe asthma, and he did what many people in America do when they have severe asthma. He didn't move to Israel, he moved to Arizona, and his asthma actually reverted, and he got off all the medications. So what does this mean for Haifa? So what this means for Haifa, and I kind of wish the mayor was sitting here, again, so I can get on his good side more, but what can you do, right? So we know now that the burden of disease increases incrementally with the increasing air pollution. And again, the media, which is what most people go by, it focuses on cancer, okay, the effects on the fetus, and you can read these things, and people have been talking to me and saying it's not really true, it is really true, it's insignificant. But I think what's more concern for the people of Haifa is the concern of cardiovascular and pulmonary disease. All right, so, I listened to, the first time I heard Dr. Kippen talk about this, I said, well, what can you do? And, because that's how I think. We're very pragmatic. All right, this is great. This is a study, but what can you do about it? So on an individual level, we talk about air purifiers, et cetera, but that's only indoor. There's nothing that you can do indoor to protect yourself, unless you want to stay indoors, which is what we recommend during periods of high pollution in New York City. But the real thing that can change things is governmental change. And fortunately, and I'm not saying this to get on anyone's good side because I've been very impressed. Fortunately, it appears to be a strong, caring leadership here in Haifa. There's no Olympics yet, and based even before the lessons from Beijing, and I pulled out these articles from some of the medical literature, including the Jewish press and the Times of Israel, which show that air quality has improved with, and I'll tell you what they did because it's very interesting. Air quality has improved 69% since 2009. And go back to the slide I showed you about disease, and think about how many lives. I mean, Rambam's in the business of saving lives. And occupational medicine is a tough field because no one ever comes up to you and says, "Oh, thank you, I didn't get cancer." I really appreciate it. I met with your head of cardiothoracic surgery yesterday, and I know everyone's always thanking him. You saved my life, you took out my cancer. But in our field, reducing the pollution 69%, you can go back to that slide I showed you and extrapolate as to how many lives, how many people didn't get lung disease, how many people didn't get heart disease. Leave the cancer aside for a second, but think about how many lives have been saved. Okay, there's been curbs on industrial activity in Haifa, and I know you have some green groups here. It's very interesting. And there's been some vehicle exclusion rules and low emissions. So I just want to read a little bit because I didn't turn these into slides. And some of the things that have been done here in Haifa, there's been stricter requirements for the petrochemical companies, and they name the companies. So 21 out of 26 of the Haifa Bay factories have set emission standards. Okay, there's been 75 pollution devices that have been put into factory smokestacks here in Haifa, and these are published and available to the public. There's been a lot more inspections. There's been 317 surprise inspections at 37 smokestacks and 25 factory inspections, including 8 surprise inspections. Okay, that's pretty significant. The other thing that's happened is the number of heavy trucks on roads in downtown Haifa during rush hours has been reduced by 67%, which again is very significant. 63 vehicles, and I hope none of yours, have been removed from the road during spot tests of emissions. 91 out of 97 Haifa Bay gas stations have installed vapor recovery systems, and 17 gas station inspections have been conducted. Environmental safety standards have been tightened for 6 pollutants. There's a national action plan to evaluate the link between public health and environmental hazards. And there's 14 calls right now, or there were last year, for proposals for research and epidemiological and environmental surveys with a value of 14 million shekels. All right, so I can take some questions. I know that for some of you this is a little bit of a different kind of field, different kind of lecture, but I hope you'll, whenever we teach the residents, I hope you take away a few things, because you're in the forefront of treating disease, and your job is to fix people that are sick, to make them better. I think from a medical point of view, and that's why I went into occupational medicine, our job is also to work with government and to work with industry. And I hate to reduce your business, but I'm sure you won't mind. Our job is also to keep people from getting sick, and here in Haifa, this is a way that we can do that. So thank you.